Hello my friends, my name is Ben and this is the 5th video in the MGN series Destiny Enemies Explained, where I strip away the basic bare bones information that surrounds the enemies of Destiny and I fill it in with their history, their lore, their personalities and all that other fun stuff. We're continuing with the Fallen, and in today's video we'll be looking at the House of Kings. Now, I've said this in pretty much all the videos except for the first, and that is in my first video, which covered the House of Devils. I covered a lot of general broad information about the Fallen that can be applied to the majority, if not all, of the traditional houses. Similar to the other houses, so far I've been only covering traditional houses. The House of Kings was a traditional house, which means that general information in the first video applies to them. So I'm not going to really be talking about that. If you're interested in the whole class system, how Ether was distributed equally amongst the different Fallen in order to create the classes like the Dregs, the Vandals, the Captains, if you want to know about the role of the Archon and the Prime Servitor, if you don't know what the Whirlwind is, stuff like that, check out the first video, because I might mention it here and there, but I won't go into too much detail. Okay, if you already know that stuff, or you don't care, stick with me, and with this out of the way, we can get started. Looking at the origin and the identity of the House of Kings, they are without a doubt my favorite house. Simply put, I think that they're the coolest. They had the, in my opinion, greatest history. They had the greatest authority amongst the Fallen, and unfortunately they were the house with the saddest end. Like I said, they were a traditional house, which meant that they had a Kell, presumably an Archon and a Prime Servitor and all the other stuff. And as a fun fact, their Kell is, as far as I'm aware, the longest known ruling Kell. The most basic information that you can get about the House of Kings is that they wore gold on their armor, and as for their motivations, they had the one singular goal which was shared with the House of Devils, Winter, and Wolves, and that was the idea of reclaiming the Traveler and forcing it, or I guess it cooperating and giving them a golden age again. They would remain in the shadows for the majority of their existence. They would never engage in open combat if they could help it, and little is known about them in general. No matter what I tell you, no matter what you go off on your own and you find out, just as a general rule, we do not know much about the House of Kings. But what we do know, and what I'm going to share with you, is, in my opinion, really interesting. Before I begin kind of properly going into this house, I'm going to read off a quote from Varix the Loyal. Now, if you don't know who Varix is or anything like that, I'm going to be covering House of Judgment in the next video, and of course that is Varix's house. So I guess this is one of our first introductions to this character. I kind of briefly mentioned him in the House of Wolves video as well. House of Kings. Name comes from the old world, from before the whirlwind. Most houses carry their name for pride. Kings carry their name because is what they are. And again, that is from Varix the Loyal, the last surviving member of the House of Judgment. So, the House of Kings existed before the Whirlwind, which was their collapse, and together with the House of Judgment, they would unite the other houses and they would become one people. Presumably, the other houses at some stage or another were separate. Either they were all on the one planet and they just didn't get along, or they were spread across their system, who knows, but at the end of the day, the House of Kings, along with help from House Judgment, would unite them all, presumably under the House of Kings as their leaders. The Whirlwind would come, shatter the fallen society and scatter them across the stars, and the House of Kings would somewhat survive, and they would follow the Traveler along with the other surviving houses, and they would settle on Earth alongside the House of Devils. Like I said, their goal was to retake the Traveler and make it give them a golden age again, so if I had to give a guess, their reason for going to Earth was in order to have close proximity to the Traveler. There's a good chance that the House of Kings fought at the Battle of Six Fronts. I've said this before, at the Battle of Six Fronts, which was the first major Fallen offensive against the city, it's never specifically stated which houses were there, but since the House of Devils and the House of Kings again had the closest proximity to the city, they are the houses with the greatest likelihood of actually being at that battle, so I'm going to make the assumption that there's a good chance that the House of Kings were there. However, the Battle of Twilight Gap is a completely different story. Now, I've found different sources saying it was the House of Devils or the House of Kings. It doesn't really matter, and I'm going to get into that later on in this video, but at the end of the day, a call came from Earth to the other fallen houses, summoning them back to Earth to prepare for one final attempt at taking back the city. or the traveler from the city. The House of Kings would fight in this battle, and alongside the other houses they would be defeated and driven back, and the House of Kings would return to the shadows. The House of Devils, their Kel Sulcus, he would lead the House of Devils into this battle and he would survive. I mentioned all of this in the first video, and like I mentioned in the first video, he would be hunted down by the legendary titan Saint 14 and he would be killed. Now, I also mentioned this probably a few times in some of my other videos. The general rule with the Kels is that whoever kills the Kel, regardless of their species, they automatically become the Kel. So when Saint 14 fought Sulcus in like a one-on-one and he won, technically he's the Kel. But he went off and disappeared to try and find Osiris, so the House of Devils were left leaderless. Leadership would eventually come in the form of their Archon, Rixus. However, it's not traditional that the Archon just take control like that. Normally, if a Kel dies, there's a replacement. And so, although they would have leadership, it would be a very unstable leadership, and so the House of Kings would take this as an advantage, and they would manipulate the House of Devils from the shadows. The House of Kings also had connections to the House of Winter through the Archon Priest Axor. So if you played Destiny 1, during the strike in which Axor is confronted, so okay, let me just quickly explain this. Basically, the House of Winter broke this Archon Axor out of the prison of elders, and my guess is they wanted to have him help them do whatever. I don't know. We ended up killing him before he could really do anything, and that was the whole purpose of this strike. If you played this strike, you would see that the area in which the boss battle took place was covered in House of Kings banners, and Axor himself wore the gold of the House of Kings. So it's heavily implied that he had some affiliation with the House of Kings. House of Kings was also the only fallen house connected to the House of Exile. Frigorus, he was an exile baron, and he was slain by quote-unquote the Guardian, or the player character, during an expedition into Hive territory on the moon. However, when the player character would kill Frigorus, it was stated that his death would weaken the House of Kings' grip on the moon, and this implies that he was sent by, or he was working with the House of Kings to some extent. What this shows, regardless of what the nature or the connection was, is that although the House of Kings was its own separate house, it had its own territory and its own hierarchy, it still demonstrated its age-old authority by keeping its connections with the other houses. And this comes into play when we get to the House of Dusk at the end of this video. Fast forward a bit, when the Kel of the House of Wolves, Skolas, proclaimed himself to be the Kel of Kels, the House of Winter willingly joined them because their Kel had been killed and they were leaderless and desperate. Skolas after this would send a wolf baron, Yavex, to the Cosmodrome in order to meet and negotiate with the House of Kings. Yavex would meet the King Barons Paskin and Vecus, whatever. It is speculated, I think it's Aldrin that speculates that the King Barons planned on murdering Yavex, but in the end every fallen in the room would die because the player character would enter and kill everyone. This isn't in the article. If you read the article, or if you're, on the article's page and you're watching the video as well. But I actually played through that mission recently, and something I didn't realize was that although the three barons were meeting and discussing, and potentially the King Barons are going to turn on Yavex, at the same time the whole facility is actually flooded with wolf fallen. There's no King Fallens anywhere. There's King Fallens? There's no Kings Fallen anywhere. Which implies that if Yavex didn't get his way, he may have actually called on his forces to just kill the barons or force them to agree with him or take them hostage. So, they were negotiating, but the evidence really points to both sides potentially, stabbing each other in the back if it didn't go their way. That's just a fun fact I wanted to add in. When the Devil Splicers, when they took control of the Archon's Forge and that whole thing during Rise of Iron took place, the House of Kings took this as a cue and they left Earth and they traveled to Mars. And then after the Devil Splicers were destroyed, this made the House of Kings the last remaining fallen house. The House Judgment doesn't really count because they only had one dude to begin with, so, that is what it is. This leads us to the fall of the House of Kings. I'm going to read another quote, and this is from the Kel of the House of Kings. I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, but it's Krask or Krask. Craask, and he said, "Thou shalt tell the Elixni to tear off their banners. Thou shalt tell them that we must all surrender to each other. We must give up our rivalries or we will not survive." And that was the mentality of this Kell at the end of the day. The fall of the House of Kings, this would ultimately begin with Uldren Sov. I mentioned him in the House of Wolves video. He is the brother to the Queen of the Reef, Mara Sov. When the Hive King Oryx entered our system in order to just kill everything to avenge the death of his son Oryx, or Crota, sorry, the Queen of the Awoken, Mara Sov again, she would do another attempt at an intervention like she did with the House of Wolves, and she would ambush his fleet and try and kill them all. And she would again use her mysterious weapons known as the Harbingers. However, Oryx is, well, he was at that stage the most powerful being from that universe, so yeah, it just didn't work on him, and it just didn't go to plan. That's all I'm going to say. It didn't go to plan. Uldren would survive this battle, and he believed that his sister the Queen survived as well, even though she was missing, and just a fun fact, she actually did technically die. He would go to Mars, that's where his search would take him, and he would become aware of the presence of the House of Kings. He would allow himself to be tracked by them, and he would allow himself to be captured by them, and when he successfully deceived them into thinking that he was no longer a threat, they brought him before the Kell Craask. However, instead of just killing Uldren, he actually allied himself with Uldren and told Uldren to tell the other houses to abandon their houses to form one new house. Again, this is all about abandoning the rivalries, and it was by this command that the House of Dusk would be formed. This is the kind of information I'll be talking about in my House of Dusk video later down the line, but we're gonna just kind of cover it briefly now. Again, this is potentially the reason why the House of Dusk would be formed. I've mentioned them in nearly all the other videos because, you know, at the end of each video, so what happened to this house? Well, the survivors would go, you know, several different places, and nearly every time one of those places would be the House of Dusk. They were a new house, they had no history at all, and they had pretty much no... I want to say they were a traditional house, but the evidence slightly points otherwise. As you would know by my House of Devils video, or just from your own knowledge, the dregs were the lowest of the fallen houses, and they had their bottom arms docked or cut off. And in order to prevent them from regrowing, they actually had docking caps placed on their stumps. And if you look at the House of Dusk dregs, yes, they don't have their four arms, the bottom two are cut off, but you can see they don't have docking caps, and the bottom two arms are beginning to grow. And I highly doubt this is because of resources. They don't have docking caps lying around. I think this is the House of Dusk just not caring anymore. So, you know, it's safe to assume that they were not a traditional house. Again, why would the House of Kings make this new house and not just say, everybody join us, we still have our Kell and we're still here? Again, it goes back to rivalries. Even though I've already stated that the House of Kings, you know, they had authority, and for the most part they were respected by the other houses, I am certain that if they came out and they said, join us, not everybody would have joined them. Because at the end of the day, the House of Kings still had a long history with the other houses, and I'm sure somewhere in there was bad blood. However, with this new house with no history and no just any kind of affiliation with the other houses, everyone could join, everyone was welcome, everyone was new. And again, this is perfect manipulation by the House of Kings. The House of Dusk would communicate with the other houses using the House of Kings frequencies and wavelengths, and if you looked at the House of Kings Fallen, yes, their main color was purple, but there was also a bit of gold on there as well. Again, showing in the background the House of Kings still is controlling things. Now, my guess is that Craask wanted to manipulate and control the House of Dusk just like he did with the House of Devils. However, his plans would never see fruition because Uldren would eventually create Fikrul, who was the first Scorn Baron, and Fikrul would kill Craask, but not before Uldren cut off his arms and effectively made him a dreg. Basically, Uldren, who was spared by Craask and had helped Craask and Craask had helped him, Uldren turned on him and murdered him and effectively destroyed the House of Kings from the inside. And then Fikrul, again the first Scorn Baron, or the Fanatic as you might know him, he would raise those dead fallen and he would create the Scorn from their bodies. So again, when we get to our Scorn video, which I'll make, there's a very good chance that when you kill Scorn, you're killing former members of the House of Kings. And that's really it. Without their, I guess, Puppet Master, the House of Dusk would really start to fall apart. They've been falling apart for several years now, but the death of Krosk and the fall of the House of Kings, that is really what started it. Yeah, without their founder, the House of Dusk would also begin to splinter. It was a very tragic end to an otherwise brilliant house. I'm just looking at my article in front of me. And this leads us to the conclusion. So it should be clear now why the House of Kings, they were my favorite house. They were ultimately always in control. They would remain in the shadows, manipulating and controlling everything. And unfortunately, they would be betrayed and destroyed. And I never understood why Krosk would trust Uldren to begin with. He literally calls him faithless and honorless in a previous quote. But at the end of the day, it is clear that this trust is actually what led to the House of Kings' downfall. And that's that. If you want to learn more about the other fallen houses, or the world of Destiny in general, you can find what I've made so far on the MGN Destiny 2 YouTube channel and on their website, where every single video I make has a article or a blog format to it. And if you want more than just the Fallen, well, you know what to do. Grant me the Kello of lore time, and I will grant you more lore in good time. Well, that's that. My name's Ben, and it's been a pleasure educating you.